the end. Great. So sharing my screen here. And just give me a second because as soon as I share a screen and then I have multiple screens, everything sort of moves over so I can't see certain things. And it makes it harder for me to follow along with all of you. So here we are. I feel like well, one quick thing, I'm going to end with this slide too, but I just wanted to let you know if you wanted to take quick note of this, that URL there, as well as the code under it. The code is a 10% discount code. We just launched Athena Academy. That URL will take you directly to it. And it's chock full with amazing faculty where we're doing a board readiness course. In fact, some amazing faculty from Florida, Nora Denzel as an example, who's on the board of Ericsson and AMD. So we're launching our very first 9-week virtual course that is chock full of incredible sessions, as well as one-on-one mentoring and open office hours. And so if you're curious about it, feel free to take a look there. And let's go to the beginning. So thanks, Sandy, for the great introduction of me. I mean, I think the thing that's most relevant about me and about Athena is, to this conversation anyway, is that we have supported over 400 women to join boards. We have supported women from Zillows and Bose and Common Spirit Health and, et cetera, to ones that you'd know, in other words, to ones that you may never have heard of, that are private equity backed or venture capital backed, or an ESOP. And I'll talk about all of those things. And the point here today is really to help you see the broader landscape. The Russell 3000 is certainly a very important part of it because it's the tip of the spear. But for most of us, it's not going to be the part that we play in. So let's kind of just a quick on who Athena is. For those of you who don't know, we are a community, a learning community. So we operate a lot in the virtual world, but we also have live meetups. In fact, our Florida region seems to be pretty active. They like to meet in person quite a lot. But most of what we do is engaged in a dynamic environment of learning together, a powerful community that helps make connections for one another. In fact, a quick story on that front, one of our members joined. She was already on the board of PNC Bank. We then got her onto the board of a company called Target Hospitality, another public company. She then met another member of Athena, who is on the board of Common Spirit Health, which is one of the largest nonprofit but paying health systems, and she's now on that board. So you can see the power of the community is pretty amazing. And we've brought women to, as I said, lots of different boards, in both directly and indirectly. And then part of what happens in that sense is that boards come to us from the outside, and they seek us out for who's in our community and who we can introduce them to. Sort of a lot like all the other communities that Lucy mentioned at the very beginning with who you're partnered with. So, I don't need to tell all of you, but I think one of the things that's super interesting and exciting about the board landscape today is that it is, without a doubt, sort of universally understood now that it's becoming more and more complicated, that boards are expected to have a much broader purview on the business, on the ecosystem around the business, on society around the business, on broader issues of sustainability. Not just environmental sustainability and global sustainability, but also human sustainability. So think about all the things that we've been challenged by in human sustainability over the last 4 years, whether it's COVID or George Floyd or, any kind of a war in Europe. These sort of impact human sustainability, as well as burnout and issues of sort of mental health and challenges around economic issues as well. So boards are having to think much more deeply and broadly than they ever did about what they're responsible for, what they're stewarding for the business, as well as for the ecosystem that the business serves. And one of the things that, sort of drove me to think more broadly about the landscape is this kind of dilemma that a lot of women have, that I see a lot of board seekers have, which is, I really want to join a board, but no one's calling me. And people keep telling me my background isn't right for a board. It's not what boards are looking for. And as a result of the first two things, I feel like I should just take whatever comes my way. And that frustration is, echoed over and over and over again. I hear this from people over and over and over again. And it actually ends up in some ways resulting in some level of protectionism too. Like, well, I don't really want to tell people what I'm doing to sort of make some inroads for myself, because then I create competition for myself and it sort of feels like a zero sum game. Because if you think about, the landscape of boards, you think about it from the perspective, say, of the Russell 3000, that's only 3,000 boards, right? So and there's a lot of people wanting to join boards. And so a lot of what I hear is this kind of frustration of, particularly if you think about where we sit in our career trajectory, a lot of us are maybe in our 50s or 60s. If we're not yet in our 50s and 60s, we're sort of getting there, and we're thinking about the next 10 years, the next 20 years. We don't retire the way the generation before us did. We're not saying I'm going to retire at 55 or 65 any longer the way we used to. We're thinking about our impact into our 80s and what that's going to look like and how we're going to stay relevant and connected. And so board work is something that a lot of us are like, well, that could be the next thing, but it's congested in that space. So how do we make sure we think about it broadly? Just quickly, I don't know, Donna, I think you're off mute and maybe there's some background noise. So it's maddening waiting, right? The perfect opportunity might find you, but that's a lot of luck. It's having powerful sponsors. It's having the right title with the right company. There's people I'll meet where it's like, oh yeah, you're going to get a board seat because you're the CXO of big name brand, right? So they're probably going to navigate their way through luck and powerful sponsorship and having the right exact title and everybody looking for them. But for most of us, we're going to have to go out and find what we're looking for. And that's where I want to make sure that you really understand the landscape. So, we think about the Russell 3000 and this initiative here is really focused on the Russell 3000. And I think that that is amazing and really important. And as Lucy said, there's in the range of 25 to 30% of those board seats are held by women. So still a quarter, roughly a quarter to a third, but and so nowhere near done. However, in the US alone, there are somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 public companies on the NASDAQ and New York Stock Exchange combined. There aren't 6,000 today because of the economic changes. There's more like 4,000 or so. And it swings, it changes because actually a lot of those public companies are micro cap and small cap companies. And so they're much more susceptible to economic swings and they look much more like private companies where there's a lot of fallout and a lot of sort of challenge to their staying power and success. But in terms of public companies, there's just as many ESOPs as there are public companies. There's more ESOPs, in fact, actually now than there are public companies. And an ESOP is an employee stock owned company. And a lot of people don't even know they exist. I admit to not having known that they existed until about 7 years ago. And I'm now on the board of an ESOP. And one of our members is actually the CEO of an ESOP that is $1 billion business in the construction space. And another one of our members recently had her join another ESOP she was on. And there's, more and more people on ESOP boards that I see. One of our coaches is on an ESOP board. And the idea behind ESOPs, if you're not familiar with them, is that the owners, usually one or a few people, or maybe a family, has a interest in creating a multi-generational business. And they really only have a few mechanisms for making that happen. they could pass it down to, if it's a family owned, you could pass it down from one generation to another. But oftentimes, the generations below don't want to take that on. Maybe it's not at a dynasty level where it's that attractive yet. So the other options are, first, get venture backing or private equity backing. But for a lot of these companies, venture backing isn't possible because venture-backed companies tend to have much more of an interest in really high multiples, really high, sort of valuations. And in the ESOP business, it tends to be much more construction companies, hard manufacturing, professional services, and those tend to be less of the play for venture capital as an ecosystem. They are actually very attractive to private equity, but usually when they're bigger than when they become an ESOP. So oftentimes ESOPs can graduate, if you will, into being private equity owned. So think of an ESOP as like, a very successful construction company, but it's localized. What Skyline Enterprises was for a long time. It was a couple $100 million. It started off, much lower at zero, but became a point where the owners of the company said, I want to create a legacy. And so I'm going to actually, rather than sell my company to private equity, where I lose the control and where the interest may not be quite aligned to my interests, I'm going to actually sell the company to the employees. And that happens through a trustee that then takes over the responsibility for administering the sale of that company to the employees through a vehicle, usually a 401k plan. And then, over time, as people retire, they can cash out on their ownership of the company. And as people, but in the meantime, they're really incented to increase the value of the company so that they can, cash out when they retire. So in that case, an ESOP, the trustee needs independent directors on the board. And this is the landscape where independent directors are relevant, right? So independence on the board is really important because you have the employee representation on the board. You have, potentially, a few other people, maybe insiders of sorts on the board. And then the trustee comes in and says, well, we don't really want a board seat, but we want somebody looking out for, the employees from the vantage point of the trustee. And so that's one place to really look and think about board opportunities. There's also 8,000 to 10,000 private equity backed companies. There's more private equity backed companies typically when there's less public companies because they stay private longer and then they're exiting into, private equity at either, 51% ownership or 100% ownership to private equity firms. And the thing to think about in terms of private equity, I'm sure some of you are very familiar with them, but private equity tends to take, if not the majority ownership, if not all of ownership, then the majority ownership. And so private equity has its own view of what it needs on a board. And there may be some level of either compromise with the founders if they're not 100% owning the company yet, where independent directors help to provide a sense of equality in the board between the founders, the prior owners, or the sort of now minority owners who used to be majority owners and the new majority owners, or the independent directors are not really so independent and they're appointed mostly by the private equity firm in agreement with the management that is still there to run the company. But largely the private equity firm is going to assess them for, do you have the disposition we have, which is oftentimes very much focused on profitability, bottom line, efficiency, capital efficiency in the business, and driving to the sort of metrics and goals that the private equity firm has, invested their thesis around. So that's a very different sort of space than the other space, which is venture capital backed. And in good times, VC-backed companies tend to have a very different profile for how they think about the board and the role of the board than the private equity does. Private equity is thinking, much more about what I said, capital efficiency and those sorts of things, whereas venture capital tends to think about, market share and growth at all costs, and forget about profitability until later. In times like now, in this sort of an economic cycle, even the VCs start talking about profitability and cutting back in economic efficiency. But traditionally, venture capital is really focused on growth. And the point that a independent director would come into play is really around the point of what you would call Series A, B, or C. And that's the point where they have revenue, they've created traction in the market, and it's all about how fast can we grow? How much more revenue can we grow as quickly as possible, grabbing as many customers as possible? So it's expansion, expansion, expansion. And that's what they're thinking about. But very few of these boards, like if you break this down and say, okay, there's 6,000 ESOPs, right now, maybe 10,000 private equity and 4,000-ish public companies, and then another, 10,000 venture-backed companies. That's at least 30,000 companies, which means about probably 200,000 plus board seats. And very few of these board seats are ever touched by traditional recruiting. In fact, over 90% of them will be filled through a very narrow network of people already in the ecosystem of the founder, the funders, or the existing board members. It's actually in part for this reason that we know that for even the most obvious board candidates, it can take 2 to 3 years for them to land a board seat. And when we think about the most vocal news with respect to women on boards, most of it is focused on the narrow set of that Russell 3000. And again, that's 10% of the landscape. It's the tip of the spear. It's doing the best. There's, at best 29% or so of those roles are filled by women. But that other 80% or 90% of the landscape, that really is not doing well. You might have 15, 16, in some cases, less than 10% representation of women on the boards, particularly in private equity. And even in the public company space, I've been talking to a lot of NASDAQ CEOs lately, and some of them have $5 to $10 million in revenue or less than 100 employees. Some of them have no revenue, right? Because they're biotech companies. So, the conversations with them are much more like the conversations I have with Series A and B and mid-stage startups than they are like a public company. So my point is here that you need to understand the full landscape, and we need to understand that it's vast, and we need to think in advance about our place in this landscape as we rise to the C-suite in the boardroom. And so, I had this sort of epiphany when I was helping my son apply to colleges. And there's this concept of the safety, the match, and the reach, which I'll get to in a minute, but it was mind-blowing to me. I was like, oh yeah, that's exactly what this is like with the board roles too. When we think about moving up the leadership ladder, we think of our careers. We're told to think of our careers as a ladder. In fact, with women, we talk about the broken rung on the ladder, right? And as if it's like this linear path. You climb this ladder, which, actually the most successful people ultimately don't just climb a ladder. There's a lot of, in fact, having interviewed lots of CEOs now, most of them didn't climb a ladder. They swung through branches of trees. They said yes to crazy assignments. They took steps down in their careers. They took steps sideways. But nonetheless, we sort of think of ourselves and our career as sort of like this progression. And I think about that similarly to the way kids kind of go through the schooling experience all the way through high school. It's this progression, right? You go from grade to grade, and you go from elementary to middle to high school. You have kind of the AP class to AP class, or the sort of this math level to that math level. And it's very linear in the thinking. And then, suddenly high school kids are applying to colleges, and they're hit with 17 questions, and they need to choose 9. And through those 9, express exactly who they are and what they want out of life and what they have to offer the world. And, for colleges, there's this series of GPA and SAT scores and AP classes and extracurriculars. And there's kind of these ways that we all know to pick your safety, your match, and your reach. Um, and there's kind of, if we take that same parallel and we apply it to our interest in boards, then you can see that there's actually a very similar sort of thing to think about here. Can't get my slide to advance. There we go. Oops. Sorry, my slide wasn't advancing, and then it double advanced. So here's the way to think about it and to figure out your place in the landscape. There's really 4 major differentiators that I start with. I touched on the first one, which is governing structure, for the entities, in terms of like, are they public? Are they venture backed? Are they private equity backed? Are they an ESOP? What's the sort of financial governing structure of the business? And then the other 3 are the lenses on the landscape that narrow in on what you might strive for, particularly for your first board role. And that's scale, business model, and industry or sector. And I want to highlight for you that, this may now feel like obvious or a light bulb, but depending on these 4 variables, the structure, the needs, the focus of the company and the board will be very different. Before thinking about your specific value proposition, which is what most people jump to, they're like, do I have a background for a board? And they're talking to a recruiter who's only ever worked with, large public companies, and they're trying to position their value proposition and think about it, and they get discouraged. Before you ever think about that, you need to sort of think first about where you fit in the landscape. We're not talking about college any longer, right? We're talking about overarching stewardship of business. And yet, if you continue this parallel, universities, their kind of variables start with GPA and SAT score, and then maybe extracurriculars and whether you saved a third world country by the time you were 10. There's certain sort of like criteria that determines whether you're remotely close to a match to a particular college. But then the rest becomes the nuance, right? And some of these things are negotiable. Similarly with colleges, some things may tend to be less negotiable. Like if you don't have a certain, standing in your GPA, you're probably not going to get into XYZ school because, you can just sort of see by the averages on that. But then there's the nuances of what you bring to the table. And so what I usually see is that scale is the number one non-negotiable. That the board, whatever board it is, they're looking for people to be able to relate to the scale where they are, if they are really large, or where they're going, if they're relatively small. So in other words, if I'm a company of 10 million in revenue, then I'm probably looking for people to join my board who have seen and driven scale to 50 to 100 million in revenue. I'm not going to go from 10 million in revenue to expect to have board members who have billions of dollars in revenue. I might, just for the cachet of it, but then I'm also missing the value of what the board's really supposed to bring, which is really helping me steward the business to the next level safely. So no matter what, for the hundreds of CEOs I've talked to, one thing that I find them really struggling to overcome and not have as a hard rule is scale. How much scale has this person seen or helped driven? Now, that's not to say that if you are, you have been, let's say, in a law firm your entire career, or you're an academic, that you're not going to have a place in boardrooms because you haven't driven or seen scale. You're going to have to apply, usually academia, it's much more about the industry and, the specific expertise you bring. So there are always exceptions to rules. if you come from a consulting background or a professional services background, like law or accounting, et cetera, then it's much more about positioning. In fact, I think lawyers are fabulous for this. I've been in hundreds of boardrooms or thousands of board meetings and hundreds of boardrooms over 30 years. And I've seen these kinds of patterns and led companies and boards through these kinds of challenges. And, so you can illustrate scale from the sidelines. And that's a really important thing to be able to do. And then business model and industry can be flexible. For example, industry, it's, if it's a regulated business, a highly regulated business like airlines, they might take somebody from another highly regulated business space like healthcare. But they want to know that you have a disposition to high regulation. If it's, a brick and mortar company, they may want somebody with SaaS or e-commerce experience because they're trying to move their business and pivot their business. So that's where it becomes a little bit more flexible and a little bit more like what's the business going through. But the important thing is to, kind of think about it this way in terms of the safety, the match, and the reach. At Stanford, a match to Stanford might be a 4.2 GPA and a 1540 on the SAT score, and those are Stanford's averages. And let's say you have a 3.8 GPA and a 1300 SAT, but you are the top violinist in the country. That might just be enough to make the difference for you to get into that school. And in a way, I think of this as equivalent to Clara Shih joining the Starbucks board when she was 29 years old, with only 2 years of management experience at that point. By convention, she was not a fit. It wasn't a match at all. It wasn't a safety. It was a reach, a complete reach for her to join that board. But she had something super special that was exactly what they were looking for. And we seem to be telling women, I think a lot of times with phrases like find your superpowers, that they need to be Clara Shih. But really, we need to tell them, identify your proper safety, match, and reach. And let's focus on the matches and the safeties for your first board. And if you get a shot at a reach, awesome. We'll, give it our best shot and let's shoot for the stars, but don't get disappointed if the stars aren't, the first thing that you're gonna nail. I want to take a pause there for a second, because the next thing I would talk about is more around kind of positioning yourself. And so if I just take a stop for a second, I can come right back to it. But were there any questions about the things I've been talking about so far? And I see there might be.
So it's not a chat. If someone just wants to unmute themselves and jump in or raise their hand.
Yeah, there was one thing in the chat, which was asking about Athena Alliance. Is it connected to Athena International?
No. We're not the same thing.
Okay.
So it's been a really interesting conversation about scale and how that's looked at, and also how advisors can get around it because they've been exposed to that scale.
Yeah. Yeah. I hear a lot of, we actually have a peer group at Athena called Women in Law Beyond the Boardroom. And that peer group, I think, came out of a bit of frustration too, that there's a lot of women in law, as an example, that would really love to serve on boards. And yet, they're also sort of banding together and saying, okay, so what else is there for us? Because this is a frustration, but at the same time, how do we support ourselves to join boards? And there's a number of roles. I actually had a similar conversation with women in the people function, or women in the technology function. Like, if you think about what's going on with boards in terms of global scale, protection of assets, sustainability of those assets, if you can remove the title of law or tech or people and instead focus on the kinds of issues that you have driven with the business, like M&A, global expansions, IP protection, cyber analysis and, risk analysis and strategy, those kinds of things, and make those the forefront of how you talk about yourself. And then sort of the title is the little piece. That's a much more helpful way, I think, to get people to think about you as a board member, as opposed to, oh, nobody ever asks for a lawyer on a board.
So 2 questions, Coco. One, I think partially you started to answer it in this one, but what if you're in the nonprofit sector or on big nonprofit boards? How do you translate that? And the second question that keeps coming up is the issue of age.
Sorry, everyone. Let me see if I can decline that call.
You know,
Yeah.
Um,
So nonprofit. So I would say 2 things about nonprofit. I mean, nonprofits operate and structure a lot like public companies because they're highly governed. The structure is highly governed, right? So you tend to have a lot more formality. So it's a great place to learn. But the best place, nonprofits are great as a launching pad to commercial boards if they are high profile nonprofits, because likely the other people around the table with you on that nonprofit board are sitting on commercial boards or have access to people who are sitting on commercial boards. So it's a strength of weak ties sort of approach. And this is something that I am really adamant about, which is it's the struggle we have is we stand on one side of, one on the South Riverbank, and we're looking across the river to the North Riverbank. And that North Riverbank is the board seat, right? And we're walking back and forth on our side, looking for a bridge. And what we really need to do is look for the little tiny stepping stones that are going to get us across the river. And you're looking for a stone that's obscured from the surface, because all of them are, but is not so deep that you're going to get, wet beyond your ankles. and then you find that first one, and that exposes the second one and the third one and the fourth one. So I think about things like advisory board roles and nonprofit board roles as you have to think about them very strategically of who else is in this ecosystem, what else do they have access to, and how do I leverage them to help me get access to the next thing I want to get access to. So I think it's great as long as you think strategically that way about it.
And I would imagine also really work that strategy. It's not just a matter of being in the room, but if you're not outspoken, you could get missed.
And I get all the time, it's interesting because I'm always at different conferences and, where there's CEOs and VCs and, all sorts of players. And after these conferences, the men always take me up on something I say, which is, if I can help you, let me know. And I get all sorts of emails from men saying, hey, you look like you're connected to so-and-so. Will you make that connection for me? And I always say, script me, sure. And I do the same for everyone, right? But we have to get used to saying that. And the more you script someone else, you say, hey, would you make this connection for me? And by the way, here's how you can do it. The more likely someone's going to say yes. And once they do it once for you, this is the Ben Franklin effect. If you look it up, they're going to say yes to you again and again.
I love that. And I love the giving them the script. We do have a question in the chat. We talked a lot about attorneys. What about physicians?
Yeah, I think physicians fabulous. I mean, there's such a incredible, need around health tech, aging tech, the transition from sort of, I think, increasingly towards technological advances and how technology and humans come together. I mean, I'm the one who says, sign me up if I start displaying Alzheimer's, anything around Alzheimer's, put the chip at the base of my brain. I think there's so much that physicians can offer, but I think what they need to do then is you need to find your ecosystem. So there are there's databases out there, for example, and I can send it to you, Sandy, so you can distribute it because I don't have it off the top of my head, where you can look at who are all the venture capital firms or the investors broadly, private equity as well, that invest in healthcare and that invest in this kind of healthcare. And so, I mean, that invest in anything, so, and who are the investors, and so then you can start to say, okay, who's in my general region, let's say, who's in my, space that's kind of looking at the things I care about, that I feel like I have something to contribute to. And then you start reaching out to those firms, and you first start off with how you can be valuable. I would love to put myself forward as a sounding board, maybe even get involved as a, let me help you with due diligence. If you ever have any questions as you're investing in these companies, feel free to reach out to me. I know a ton about this area. It's a great place too, that I would say one of the biggest things that women can do to get on boards is start investing in companies. And we see this from our male counterparts, and they are much more comfortable with writing $10,000, $25,000 checks and getting involved early in the landscape of building companies from scratch. I think that's a great place for people who have had, great career in a field that is difficult to transition to a board seat from, is to then start getting involved in the ecosystem that builds new companies, particularly for aging tech and femtech.
Yeah, it's really interesting because it goes back to your strategy about this is a long-term stepping stones. And very often people look at the ultimate prize of the board seat that's going to pay them $100,000 a year.
That's
right. That they have to invest in.
That's right. I think that's another important thing to think about is why are you wanting a board seat? Because if it is about the economics, like if it is about, I need something that will, cover some portion of my expenses at some point, then, you will be narrowed to public companies or ESOPs. Now, I will say that the big misnomer with public companies is two things. One is it's not the get rich quick scheme. You might get, 60, 100, maybe, in the largest companies, 200,000 in cash. And then you're going to get that equivalent in stock, and your cash is going to cover, if you're lucky, your cash is going to cover your tax issues, and you're going to be expected to hold on to your stock year over year for some period of time. And so, you kind of have to go into it with eyes wide open, and you might want to carry extra insurances. So you're going to get into it eyes wide open to say, this isn't, I don't just have this extra cash. I also have this extra burden because I'm expected to weather the storms and hold on to the, even if the stock's doing great and I want to cash out, I'm not allowed to. And so a better bet, honestly, is to join an ESOP board, because they tend to be cash only. You don't get any stock. And if you're just looking for $40,000, $60,000 extra, then that might be the better play. So to think about these things, and in private equity, there's usually cash, but they also oftentimes expect you to invest that cash back into the business, which is a weird part of that model.
So we've got a couple of good comments in here. Loretta just wanted to asked you to expand more on insurance. And then I also want to go back to Gail, who had kind of a comment question first. But Loretta, wanted to so let's talk about expanding more on insurance. And I don't know, Loretta, if you have a specific question about it. Probably D&O insurance.
Yeah, I mean, most all companies are going to have D&O insurance that are looking for an independent director, but if they don't, it's a great opportunity for them to get it. And if they're not going to get it, then do not join the board.
It comes up with very small companies who may not have it yet, but they're not going to be paying you at that point anyway. But yeah, is Ruth still on the call? I know Ruth's got a lot of experience in D&O insurance. Do you want to jump in?
Sure, Sandy. You really need to understand what the board owns as far as a D&O policy. They range from policy that I consider trash versus outstanding. And so how many folks on the board actually read the policy and understand the exclusions? And make sure that the board has a really good brokerage that can answer your questions. I work for a private equity firm and I deal with their cyber as well as D&O insurance. And I can tell you in companies that we're acquiring, you really see where they're not that savvy in getting the correct coverage. You need what I call a bulletproof policy that's going to protect you and not invade your personal assets. So there's also some coverage called Side A, which over and above the regular D&O coverage, the company can buy Side A, which is additional protection for board members that should a company be unable to indemnify you or back you up, this Side A comes down and protects the directors.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
And sometimes people will just, in general, expand their own umbrella policies and sort of create additional, that's what I meant by you might end up spending more money too, is depending on how you look at the risk personally and what else you've got going on and how you've protected your assets under trusts or other things, you might decide to add more to your own personal umbrella.
Gail, did you want to add some comments about your experience? Because you've worked in some alternate ownership structures.
Oh, great.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. The point, Coco, that you made about the investment, I sat on a financial services board for a couple decades, and we went private. We were private, public, and then we went private again. And I think one of the things that kept me in the loop and engaged as a board member, and the only woman on the board, was that I was able to still contribute, and the equity investment that my male colleagues were able to do. I wasn't writing the big checks that they were, but the fact that I was still engaged from that financial perspective really meant a lot to be able to continue sitting at the table with them, and they respected it. And so the fact that you brought that point out to the ladies on the call, that's a very, very powerful play that we as women need to consider when we want to stay at the table.
Yeah.
So, Coco, another question that comes up is about age.
Oh, right. I was just thinking to myself, I felt like there was another, age. The average age of the board director, as you all know, is still 62, 63. It's which means that there's also people who sit on boards into their 70s and 80s. And I personally know a number of women who are over that average age who are contributing amazingly to boards. And I think the issue that you want to get people to think about is, don't look at me for age, look at me for contemporary experience. And there's ways to get that. I think about, I hesitate because I don't want to in any way imply that Betsy Atkins is older. I'm going to say Betsy Atkins is younger than me. But if you know Betsy Atkins, as an example, she's served on like 27 boards and taken 13 companies public. And, she is an advisor to Google's cloud business. She doesn't have a tech background, not in the modern, not in the modern technologies of the last 10 years, but she keeps herself relevant. And keeping yourself relevant is participating in things like this. Yesterday we did a salon at Athena on understanding the earliest stage of venture all the way through unicorn companies. We're doing a salon coming up, I think maybe next week or the week after, on understanding generative AI and what it means in the boardroom. And you know, if you're leaning into those kinds of lifelong learner interests, then you're maintaining your sharpness for boards. And what you want to be able to do is, you know, say, hey, look, well, first of all, I personally would hide some of the things that immediately say how old you are. Like, maybe don't put the year you graduated on your LinkedIn, and consider not putting all of your experiences on LinkedIn. Like, just put the last, you know, 20 years if that's like, but don't put everything on there. Don't make it obvious to people what your age is, because there's this saying in sales, never give somebody an opportunity for objection. Like, why would you do that? Right. So just think about all the opportunities for objection that you give people on a day-to-day basis. Just take those off the table, right? Let that come up later, you know, when they see you maybe, and they're like, oh, you're older than I thought you were going to be, right? In their own minds. But then now, you know, that's something you can't overcome necessarily, other than to say, I want to start by illustrating to you how contemporary I am, right? And that's where you lead with how contemporary you are, not with, you know, my years of experience go back to the 70s, right? Like, that's no longer what they want to hear.
What about the other end of the spectrum? I mean, this is a mixed group on this call, and we
Yeah.
talked about all these stepping stones. Do you start working on this when you're in your 40s, in your 30s?
Yeah, I mean, Clara Shih, 29. Caroline Say, she's on the board of Coca-Cola. She's on the board of Morningstar. She is on the board of Morningstar. She was 32, I think, when she got her first board seat. You know, it's a bell curve, right? So there's always outliers on both sides. And this is again about your safety, match, and reach. It's like really thinking through where we're gonna, you know, what am I up against? Am I an outlier in some form or fashion? And how do I overcome that? But I was, you know, I had my first executive role when I was 28 years old. And, you know, I say at Athena, we have a bell curve. Most of the women in Athena are in their mid 40s to mid 60s, let's say, but we have people in their 80s. We have a couple of women in their 80s in Athena, one of them on the call here. She doesn't have to raise her hand. And, you know, we have some people who, like me, would have fit to Athena at 28 years old and are. I served on my first board when I was 31 because I became part owner of the company that I was running. So I think the earlier we think about the whole of our potential, the bigger our potential becomes. And I didn't think about it that way at all. But I think if you can, you know, as we are in our 20s, we're mostly just thinking about establishing something. In our 30s, we're really thinking about becoming kind of known for it. And in our 40s, I think we need to be thinking about ourselves as a portfolio. And, you know, that means that you should think about, can I start investing in the private market? Because that's where the wealth creation happens, actually. You know, can I be investing differently than I'm investing? Can I become an advisor? Can I write a book? Can I become a CEO? You know, think broadly about yourself. And the more you do and you make yourself a lifelong learner, the more potential is there.
This has been great. So just as a timekeeper thing, I know that we're getting closer to 1 o'clock. We can keep this link open for quite a bit longer if people want to talk amongst themselves. But Coco, did you have some other materials that you wanted to share with us?
Well, I know, because there's only 6 minutes. The rest of my materials, I'm happy to come back and talk more at any time. And I think the next dive would be to go into a little bit more about how you think about yourself and your experiences in that safety, match, and reach exercise. And so I'll just give you the high level without showing you slides. The way I think about that is, you know, take over some portion of your house. My son and I took over our kitchen. We took over the pantry door, the fridge, all of the, you know, various cabinets, and we put sticky notes everywhere. And so do this for yourself as well. Like, what have I experienced? What have I lived through? You know, what do other people say about me? And ask them, you know, what, and if you can't remember some of these things, like, ask people, when we worked together, what were the like most amazing things you think we did? You know, or that I did, you know, because I'm kind of struggling right now. I can't think of anything great about myself, which is sort of what we all say. But what have I learned? What have I contributed? What have I led? What powers me? What makes me special? What do I want to give? What do I want to experience? And when you throw all of that up on sticky notes, one thought per sticky note, throw it everywhere, wherever you can, then you step back from it and you start to organize it. So the problem that we have as, when people say, what's your value proposition, is we sit down with a piece of paper or, a Word doc, and we write linearly, but we aren't linear, right? So this way you get freed to just sort of put it all out there and then start organizing it and taking these various different things and starting to structure them. And when you do, you come up with experiences and themes and unique characteristics. Like, for example, for me, I built a company from the ground up 2 times, and once to over 50 million in revenue. So experientially, I'm an entrepreneur, right? And that is also a characteristic of mine. I've operated through 3 massive economic downturns now. One that nearly wiped out my business. I've had to lay off over my 30-year career, almost or over 1,000 people. And when I think about those kinds of things, I'm not saying that that's fabulous. However, I think private equity would definitely resonate with some of these things, because they would trust in what I'm able to navigate through and steward. Same with ESOPs. I've been in professional services. People have been my product. Technology is an enabler. So that's where I came up with ESOPs and PE. That's kind of my space. So that sort of narrows things for me. So I'm really super, condensing that, but it's a great exercise to go through if you have some time this summer, maybe to invest in yourself, to think about those kinds of things. And maybe it'll result in you writing a book, or maybe you'll decide that you really want to invest in certain up and coming kinds of businesses.
I can speak for myself. It's just a great exercise, whether you're job hunting or looking at board position or anything else. It's a good exercise for you to know about yourself.
Yes, absolutely. And if you want to spend a little time with us, we would be happy to have any of you join our board course that we're launching June 6th, but we're launching another one in September. I put the link to it here. That's going to align more to the East Coast time zone. So if you want to wait till September. But yeah, are there any last minute questions?
I think there's one from Gail in the,
Oh, good.
it says, can you speak to overcoming the stigma of corporate E-suite versus entrepreneur candidates?
It's a great question.
Yeah.
It really affects my experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a challenge, I have this challenge myself. I've never been in a public company, but I having run a professional services company, operated in consulting with a lot of public company C-suite executives around their IT environment, because that was my last career. So it's similar, I think, to, that being the difficulty is it's similar to being a lawyer or other professional services is you're going to have to talk about what you drove from the outside. Or if you're an entrepreneur, you may find that the first boards that you can join are going to be other entrepreneurial boards, which are, again, ESOPs. And mostly venture capital backed, because by the time they hit private equity, they're probably not so entrepreneurial any longer. But in venture capital and in ESOPs, there's much more of an entrepreneurial disposition. For example, I'm on the board of an ESOP called Archer Point, and they're about a $30 million business, and I've grown a company to over 50. So they, were really excited about having my entrepreneurial perspective as they drove to that next level of growth.
So quick final question about getting the attention of the ESOPs. They're not going to go through the formal corporate recruiters. And so you start off with this, are you okay?
Yes.
It's getting their attention and the outreach so that you can make that match.
Yeah. And there's a couple of things to do. There is actually organizations like ours, join organizations like ours and start to navigate or make friends with people who are on ESOPs, you know, so make connections with people who are on ESOPs. Also, if you do a Google search on ESOPs, there's big organizations that support ESOPs, and you can start to look at like who are the ESOP companies and who you know, which ones are sort of resonate with me or are in my area, and who from my LinkedIn or my Athena network or my, you know, any other network that I'm a part of, you know, who could potentially introduce me to those people. The other one is I also I'm a member of Private Directors Association, which tends to have a lot of ESOP and other private company board opportunities there as well, which I think is great. So those would be some of the things I would recommend is researching ESOPs and then start to figure out who in your network or extended network could make some connections.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Covered a lot of ground, and yes, we could keep asking you questions for the next hour, I'm sure. We want to let everybody know we're going to keep this link open for another half hour if we want to talk amongst ourselves. I'm not sure how much more time that Coco has, but I really do want to thank you for a really informative presentation.
Thank you. I can check how much time I have. I think I have a little extra time if anybody wants, or I can drop off if you want to have a call, talk amongst yourselves.
Actually, I have a question. First of all, thank you, Coco. Thank you not just for this presentation, but for the work you do in the world. It's so important. I'm not going to cry, but like I really am with you, and I'm so grateful that there's women like you in the world talking to women like us. So thank you. I do have a question. I'm just looking at the link that you put in the chat. And so for me, like the value of a program like yours would really be the people in it. I know myself, I would go through the class, I'd check all the boxes, and then I'm afraid it would sit in the drawer. So can you tell us a little bit about, you know, what's included in the annual membership as it relates to getting to know other people?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of what we're doing at Athena, so beyond that course, being a member of Athena, one of the things that is like a daily mantra of mine is challenge my team. We have a team of people called member success managers who you can just press the little gold icon and say, I'm looking to meet with people who have backgrounds with ESOPs, who have backgrounds with, you know, venture capital in the healthcare space, who or, you know, sometimes our members will say things like, I'm shutting down offices in Russia. Who can I talk to? Or recently, we had a ransomware attack and I need to talk to somebody who understands negotiations. Like a big part of what Athena is about is the strength of weak ties. So our ecosystem is there to support each other through day-to-day challenges and goals. And we make it easy by saying, you don't have to go hunt around and find those other people. We'll make the connections for you. So in addition to sort of going through programmatic stuff that we have, like this course, you can make a community within Athena that's an extension of the other communities that you have. So we have peer groups of women in biosciences, and we have peer groups of women in venture or venture curious and entrepreneurs and all sorts of different kinds of peer groups as well. And then we're constantly doing live virtual learning that also then results in a library that has hundreds of hours of content. You can follow our Path to the Boardroom, 11 seasons and 74 modules. And I mean, we really do cover everything. And then our coaches also, for those of you who really want board seats, 5 or 6 of our coaches are super experienced board directors. They're on NASDAQ and ESOP boards and private equity boards. And so their coaches are also there to guide you as you need.
There are a number of terrific organizations.
Thank you.
But Nina, you brought up a point about put it in the drawer. And so my advice is, whichever form you're taking, either for education or for networking, you have to work it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Putting it in the drawer is bad. That's no other way to say it, because you won't get the
Yeah, I'm
value.
just wondering like how much of the community is active. So it sounds like there's a chat, you know, essentially where I can request things. And it sounds like for me, my background's worldwide technologies and American Express, and then, you know, worldwide marketing at HP, and then JP Morgan Chase. I have a lot of Fortune 500 experience as a independent boutique management consulting company of my own. And I thank you for doing this because I had no idea where to go. And I called Sandy one day and this just so happened to fall into place a week later. So yeah, I feel like I have like the right store goods, but I really wouldn't even know how to approach it to some of the people that I have worked with in the past, so so I just wondered, it sounds like that there's coaching involved in addition to the outreach of the chat after the class. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yes, after the class, there's coaching, there's a community, there's a year of, embed yourself in everything that you want. And then as Sandy said, you have to not put it in a drawer, but also we help you not, because our member success managers will both prod you, but also be there to do the heavy lift of any kind of connection that you want. So you don't have to do it for yourself. I think Barbara wanted to say something.
Yeah,
Thank
I just wanted to share because there are so many organizations, like Sandy said, but if you click on the website that we talked about, Women on Boards Florida, there is a section there and it's called resources. And you should go down there because depending on the niche or the type of program you're looking for, there's many different ones. So I think that's a great resource to use also to see what's available to you.
Absolutely.
Thanks,
Yeah.
ladies.
There's still people around who still have a varied background. So, Sarah, you're smiling, your background's completely different from most of the
I'm
others.
smiling. I'm just listening. I'm a business school professor. I'm associate dean here at the College of Business. So we just had a session with Patricia Flynn on boards, and I've been teaching board readiness classes. So it's really fun to hear. And I love your perspective actually on the academic piece, women academics on boards.
Yeah. Oh, good.
Anybody else want to join the conversation?
Nobody wants to miss what might come up, but
I guess I
Oh,
could.
this is Gail. This is Gail. I just wanted to say thank you. Now the phone rings. Thank you so much for doing this because you can never know enough in this process. It is a moving target, and I'm so grateful you took the time to chat with us today. Greatly appreciated. Thank you.
well, thank you. And I'm so excited about the work you're all doing in Florida, and I've no doubt you're going to get those. I mean, maybe, I'm there to help you any way I can to get those 50 women on boards this year that you have as your goal for the Russell 3000. I think that's amazing, and get Florida to catch up.
We're working on it. It's going to be a lot of networking. And I know some of the women here still on the call are phenomenal networkers. I don't want to call anybody out, but Marty, I was thinking of you as that. You know everybody, you talk to people, you always link people up.
Yeah, I'm been thinking, of course, this whole time, as I was also eating my lunch. Sorry about that. Yeah, so most of my career is with Pepsi Cola bottlers. And I was not in a C-suite, but I was the vice president of the Florida division, managing about 640 employees and over 300 million in revenue. And then I'm also in the wealth management industry. And I've been the chairman of the board of the Palm Beach County Food Bank for going on 6 years now. I just feel that my niche is in the food industry. Would you agree with that? That's a hard one. Sorry.
Well, no,
I mean, it depends, right? I suppose.
Well, I would say that the, consumer products, I don't know that it necessarily is food, but consumer products, and maybe where large sort of supply or distribution and packaging are kind of
Marketing.
Yeah, I was just thinking in terms of like what kinds of when you say bottling and, so what are the, what are the businesses beyond just food that might have a parallel challenge to the kinds of things you ran for Mexico? That's where I would go a little broader than food. I would say consumer products. And I would say, if the bulk of what you have been focused on in that side of your career has been really around distribution and packaging, then where are the businesses that are going to have big distribution and packaging challenges? And some of the things I think about there too is like boards are increasingly really being tested on the question of sustainability and global supply chain. And so I think, the global supply chain sustainability one is a really interesting angle to push for you, because that is, you see it, whether people like the ESG terminology or they don't. The fact is that companies are being scrutinized more and more and more about understanding every step in their global supply chain and distribution model, and scope 1, 2, and 3 of of environmental sustainability challenges. I think there's a lot you can play with.
Okay, thanks.
Interesting.
I saw a bunch of laughing. Are people like, is there something else going on? Oh.
You're just saying stuff that makes us smile because it's on point.
Oh. I was like, why is everybody laughing?
When you hit the bullseye, it's a reason to smile.
Oh.
We started talking about supply chain, and of course, Elena, you're the supply chain goddess. And I think you're also an Athena Alliance member. This question about supply chain and ESG and bringing that all together.
Yes, I am, but I have a problem with my voice. I cannot speak. That's why I've been so quiet. But thank you, Coco, for being with us. I think this has been a great opportunity.
Elena, did I meet you at a meetup in Florida with Cindy Mancini? Oh, hi.
Yeah, I do. You did a month ago when I was returning to the Philippines, from the Philippines.
Yes. Oh, don't talk. It's making me hurt.
I know.
And I have a meeting later with Sandy.
Yeah, you are a supply chain guru. I think it could be really interesting to even maybe like one of the things that could be really interesting out of that is like Elena and Marty, if you get together and write maybe something, and we pull together a couple other people and really sort of focus on something about global supply chain and sustainability from all levels, human sustainability, environmental sustainability, right? Like that is, I think, one of the biggest topics. It's super interesting, and it's going to be one of the hottest topics. And then we get NASDAQ to publish it. They're always looking to publish articles about, things on the governance level. And I have a direct link in, so I'm happy to help with that.
It's a great example of taking something and elevating it, as well as increasing your visibility.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
Well, that may be a good, strong way for us to thank everyone else for participating, and Coco again. And we're all going to take home tidbits from this for sure.
Good. I'm taking a note that we should get this article. Let's figure this out.
I made the note to send the email connection so that you guys can talk.
Yeah, I would be happy to work with Elena. I'm not that versed on global distribution. So that's actually good, because then I can learn a lot from you guys.
We
Yeah.
actually have an exec PhD student here who's CEO of Lian Feng, and I'm on his committee, and he does global supply chains and redoing them in this era. So moving not just in the countries that you think about, but exposure to others because of the geopolitical landscape. And then I just reviewed one for the Belgian funding agency today, but in Belgium doing interviews on supply chains for, we typically think about manufacturing firms, but then also service firms. And, if you can outsource human capital, there are ethical issues. Should you employ a bunch of people in Vlerick, Belgium, or is it better to have an outsourced center in the Philippines? So I think there's lots of interesting issues there.
Really big questions. Well, I
Yeah.
will add you to this email intro so that you all can follow up.
Yeah, I'd like to have you add me onto that one as well. I would love to be a part of that.
We're doing a salon also, if you want to, even if you're not a member of Athena, you can audit it if you will, but a salon on impact sourcing, which is really interesting. It's talking about this global supply chain of human capital.
It just seems no matter what we do or where we are, the global aspect of business is an integral part of everything we do and who we touch, whether it's inside the organization or the clients that we serve. So that would be great.
Yep, 100%. Yep. And also, to that point, I was just on the phone with a private equity firm that has about 4 billion in assets under management from based in they all their investments are in the UK and Ireland. And on a global level, all those companies are saying we want to go global. And what they mean is we want to go to the US, which is interesting. I mean, because we think we want to go global and we're thinking about, Europe and Asia. And but so they're thinking about how do they get board members on the boards of those companies, and who doesn't want to go to London 4 times a year, right? So anyway, so global is a real interesting play. Okay, I know we've got to, I think I'm getting the hook.
Katie, what's the next step here? I know is Coco coming back to do another presentation, or I saw on the website that there's something on the 23rd. What do board members really do anyway? Is that the next?
That was actually our first session.
Oh.
So that was back in January.
Oh, it says March 23rd on the website. Okay, no worries. It does say pass, but
Oh,
whatever.
I'm sorry. Actually, that was March 23rd. I think our first one was about the different types of boards. So you're right.
Okay.
Yes. We'll need to update our website, but thank you.
No, that's okay. I was just wondering for everyone here, I know obviously there's an offer to join Athena. Is there any other, immediate next steps that we can keep our eyes and ears open for as a community?
So our Zoom conversations are going on summer break.
Okay.
But very happy to discuss other ways we can facilitate this. And I mean, of course, two of us can talk about, what resources work for you and that kind of follow up.
That's exactly too why I said about look at the resource list, because I think it has some great suggestions in addition, because we really started off this initiative having to do with increasing the number of women on boards and reaching out to the corporations and reaching out to connections. But we had asked for some great webinars. So that's what we've done. So, but there are others too, Nina, we can talk about too.
Okay, I see. I found where you were looking. I didn't realize, I thought it was just one page, but I realize now that it's a bunch of pages. I'll put it in the chat for anyone else who had a little bit of a hard time finding it as well. But thank you for being patient and restating what you just said. So thank you all. All right.
Thank you,
Good to
Sam.
see you all.
Everyone.
Always fun to get to visit folks. Take care.